Hey everyone, welcome back. There's something about Southeast Asia that draws travelers from all over the world. The temples, the culture, the incredible food, the warmth of the people. But what many visitors don't realize is that beneath all that beauty lies a spiritual world most outsiders never truly understand. A world where ancient beliefs about spirits, curses, and supernatural forces are not just folklore, but living realities that shape daily life. Tonight's story is about a 26-year-old American backpacker named Tyler, who learned this lesson in the most terrifying way possible. Someone who thought accepting a simple gift from a kind stranger would be harmless. Someone who discovered that in Indonesia, not everything offered freely should be taken home. By the time Tyler realized what he had brought into his life, it was already too late. Indonesia is a nation built on layers of spiritual tradition that stretch back thousands of years. From the bustling markets of Jakarta to the ancient temples of Yogyakarta, from the beaches of Bali to the remote villages of Java, spiritual practices are woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Walk through any traditional market, and you'll see vendors selling not just fruits and vegetables, but also charms, talismans, and ritual objects. Some of these items carry genuine blessings crafted by respected spiritual practitioners to bring protection, prosperity, or good fortune. But others, hidden among the legitimate offerings, carry something far more dangerous. In Indonesian folklore, these cursed objects are known by many names. Pelet for binding love spells, guna-guna for general black magic, penglaris for business curses, santet for the most malevolent forms of spiritual attack. These practices didn't disappear with modernization. They evolved, adapted, and in some cases became more sophisticated. And unsuspecting foreigners, drawn by curiosity or politeness, often become the easiest targets. But before we get into what happened, let me take you back to where it all started. Tyler had been planning his Southeast Asian adventure for months. Fresh out of college with a degree in international relations, he'd saved up enough money working part-time jobs to fund a 3-month solo backpacking trip. Indonesia was his main destination. He wanted to experience everything the archipelago had to offer. The pristine beaches of Lombok, the ancient temples of Borobudur, the vibrant nightlife of Seminyak, the cultural heart of Yogyakarta. This wasn't just a vacation for Tyler. It was a journey of self-discovery, a chance to immerse himself in a culture completely different from his suburban American upbringing. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Tyler was exactly the kind of traveler Indonesia welcomes with open arms. Tyler had been in Indonesia for 2 weeks when our story truly begins. His routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm that many solo backpackers would recognize. Morning started early with street food breakfast from whichever warung was closest to his accommodation. Nasi gudeg in Yogyakarta, gado-gado in Jakarta, fresh tropical fruits from roadside vendors. He loved trying everything, even dishes he couldn't pronounce. The sellers always seemed delighted by his enthusiasm, teaching him basic Indonesian phrases and laughing at his pronunciation attempts. His days were spent temple hopping, visiting traditional markets, and exploring neighborhoods that weren't in any guidebook. Tyler had that quality that made locals warm up to him quickly. He was genuinely interested in learning about Indonesian culture, not just taking photos for social media. He'd spend hours talking with guesthouse owners about local customs, asking questions about the meaning behind temple ceremonies, showing real respect for traditions he was only beginning to understand. But even in those first innocent weeks, there were signs that something was different about Tyler's experience. Small things that he dismissed or rationalized away. Stray dogs, normally friendly to tourists carrying food scraps, would growl and back away when they saw him coming. Street vendors at the markets would sometimes stop their conversations mid-sentence when he approached, watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Not hostile exactly, but intensely curious, like they were trying to figure something out about him. At his guest house in Yogyakarta, Tyler would lie awake at night, listening to what sounded like distant chanting coming from somewhere in the neighborhood. The sound would drift through his window between 2 and 4 in the morning, rhythmic and haunting, sung in a language he didn't recognize. When he asked his guesthouse host about it the next morning, the older man would just shrug and change the subject, suddenly becoming very interested in discussing breakfast options or day trip recommendations. Tyler's personality made him particularly vulnerable to what was coming. He was the kind of person who always tried to be polite, especially when traveling. His parents had raised him to be respectful of other cultures, to never refuse hospitality, to show gratitude when locals went out of their way to be kind. These were admirable qualities, but in certain situations, they could also be dangerous. Tyler had no way of knowing that his openness and trust were being observed, evaluated, making him the perfect candidate for what Indonesian spiritual practitioners call a willing vessel, someone who would accept a cursed object not through force or deception, but through their own politeness and cultural sensitivity. The encounter that changed everything happened on Tyler's 15th night in Indonesia. He was exploring the Malioboro Street night market in Yogyakarta, one of the most famous shopping areas in Java. The narrow alleyways were packed with vendors selling everything from batik clothing to traditional snacks to handcrafted souvenirs. The air was thick with the smoke from satay grills and the sweet aroma of gudeg simmering in massive pots. Tyler was in his element, weaving through the crowds, practicing his limited Indonesian with vendors, haggling good-naturedly over prices for gifts he wanted to bring home. That's when she appeared. An elderly Indonesian woman, probably in her 70s, wearing traditional Javanese dress and a warm, grandmotherly smile. She approached Tyler as he was examining a display of wooden masks, her English heavily accented but clear enough to understand. She complimented his interest in Indonesian culture, asked about his travels, seemed genuinely pleased that a young American was taking the time to learn about Java's traditions. Tyler was charmed by her friendliness, happy to chat with someone who seemed so knowledgeable about local customs. The conversation felt natural, comfortable, the kind of cultural exchange he'd hoped for when planning his trip. Then she reached into a small cloth bag she was carrying and pulled out what looked like a small carved wooden pendant on a leather cord. The carving was intricate, depicting what appeared to be traditional Javanese symbols Tyler didn't recognize. The wood was dark, polished smooth by age, with tiny details that must have taken hours to complete. The woman explained that it was a protection charm, blessed by spiritual practitioners to keep travelers safe during their journeys. She said she could see that Tyler had a pure heart and good intentions, that he deserved protection during his time in Indonesia. The pendant would bring him luck, keep away negative spirits, ensure safe travels, and she wanted to give it to him as a gift, no payment required, just her way of welcoming him to Java. Tyler hesitated, not because he sensed danger, but because he felt awkward accepting such an obviously valuable handmade item for free. The craftsmanship alone suggested it was worth significant money, but the woman insisted, pressing the pendant into his palm with both her hands, her eyes twinkling with what seemed like genuine affection. She told him to wear it always while in Indonesia, especially at night, and to never let anyone else touch it. The blessing would only work if he was the sole owner. Out of politeness and gratitude, Tyler accepted the gift. He thanked the woman profusely, carefully placed the pendant around his neck, and tucked it under his shirt. The moment the leather cord settled against his skin, something in the atmosphere around them shifted. The woman's smile seemed to change, becoming more satisfied than warm. The usual bustle of the night market felt suddenly muted, like someone had turned down the volume on the entire street. Other vendors, who had been chatting and laughing moments before, were now staring in Tyler's direction, with expressions ranging from concern to something that looked almost like pity. Even the stray dogs that usually wandered through the market, begging for scraps, had disappeared entirely. Tyler noticed these changes, but his rational mind immediately began providing explanations. The shift in atmosphere was probably just his imagination, heightened by the unfamiliar cultural context. The stares from vendors were likely just curiosity about the foreign tourist who'd been given such an obviously significant gift. The sudden quiet was probably just a natural lull in the evening's activities. He thanked the woman again, said goodbye, and continued exploring the market. But for the rest of the night, nothing felt quite the same. Colors seemed slightly muted, sounds felt distant and hollow, and Tyler found himself constantly looking over his shoulder with the persistent feeling that someone was following just out of sight. Back at his guest house, Tyler carefully placed the pendant on his nightstand and examined it more closely under the room's fluorescent light. The carving was even more intricate than he'd realized, with symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle he viewed them from. There was something almost hypnotic about the patterns, the way they seemed to flow into each other in endless loops. The wood felt warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been after sitting on the cool nightstand, and there was a faint smell emanating from it. Not unpleasant exactly, but organic and earthy, like soil after rain mixed with something Tyler couldn't identify. That night, Tyler's dreams were unlike anything he'd experienced before. Vivid, intense visions of Indonesian landscapes he'd never seen, ancient temples shrouded in mist, figures in traditional dress performing rituals around flickering fires. The dreams felt more real than reality, so detailed and immersive that when Tyler woke up, he had trouble distinguishing between what he'd actually experienced and what his subconscious had created. But even more disturbing than the dreams themselves was the fact that he could remember every single detail with perfect clarity, as if his mind had been recording everything in high definition. The morning after that first night with the pendant, Tyler woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. His body ached in ways that made no sense, muscles sore as if he'd been walking for hours instead of lying in bed. But it was more than physical exhaustion. There was a heaviness in his mind, a fog that coffee and a cold shower couldn't clear. When he looked in the small mirror above the guest house sink, his reflection seemed off somehow. Not dramatically different, but like he was looking at himself through water, slightly distorted, slightly delayed. Tyler tried to rationalize everything away. The intense dreams were probably just his brain processing all the new cultural experiences. The physical exhaustion was likely from weeks of travel, sleeping in different beds, eating unfamiliar food. The strange feeling about his reflection was probably just poor lighting in the guest house bathroom. But as he got dressed and prepared for another day of exploration, Tyler found himself unconsciously reaching for the pendant, making sure it was still there beneath his shirt. The wood felt warm against his fingers, almost alive, and touching it brought an odd sense of comfort mixed with unease. That day, Tyler noticed more changes in how people reacted to him. At the warung where he'd been eating breakfast for 3 days running, the friendly owner who usually greeted him with a smile and broken English seemed nervous, distracted. She served his nasi gudeg without the usual cheerful conversation, her eyes constantly darting to his chest where the pendant hung hidden beneath his shirt. When Tyler tried to engage her in their usual morning chat about local attractions, she gave short, clipped responses and found excuses to busy herself with other customers. Similar interactions happened throughout the day. The ticket seller at Borobudur Temple, who should have been used to foreign tourists, stared at Tyler with an expression of barely concealed concern. A group of local students who had been friendly and eager to practice their English the day before suddenly seemed reluctant to approach him. Even children who had been excited to see a young American tourist now hung back when their parents weren't looking, watching him from a safe distance with wide, curious eyes. But the most unsettling change was in Tyler himself. As the day progressed, he began experiencing moments of disconnection, brief periods where he felt like he was observing his own actions from outside his body. He would find himself standing in front of temple reliefs or market stalls with no memory of how he'd gotten there. Conversations with vendors would start normally, but then Tyler would realize he'd been speaking for several minutes without consciously choosing his words, as if someone else was using his voice. That evening, back at his guest house, Tyler decided to research the pendant more thoroughly. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about Indonesian spiritual artifacts, protective charms, traditional blessing ceremonies. What he found made his stomach drop. Article after article described the difference between legitimate protective talismans, which were always blessed in formal ceremonies by recognized spiritual practitioners, and cursed objects used in Indonesian black magic practices. The legitimate charms were typically made with specific materials, blessed during particular moon phases, and given only after proper spiritual consultation. They were never handed out randomly to strangers, especially not to foreign tourists who couldn't possibly understand their spiritual significance. The cursed objects, on the other hand, were often given freely to unsuspecting victims as part of elaborate spiritual attacks designed to bind negative entities to the recipient. Tyler read about Pele, love-binding spells that could make someone obsessively attached to their target. Guna-guna, general black magic used for revenge or control. Panglaris, business curses designed to drain someone's financial success. And Santet, the most dangerous form, which involved binding malevolent spirits to objects that would then attach themselves to whoever possessed the item. The symptoms described in these articles matched exactly what Tyler had been experiencing: the exhaustion, the disconnection, the feeling of being watched, the changes in how others perceived him. One article particularly caught his attention. It described how modern practitioners of Indonesian black magic had adapted their methods to target foreign tourists, recognizing that visitors unfamiliar with local spiritual customs made ideal victims. The process was sophisticated and deliberate. Practitioners would identify tourists who seemed particularly open to cultural experiences, gather personal information about them, and then approach them with carefully crafted stories designed to make acceptance of cursed objects seem like genuine cultural exchange. The article explained that once a cursed object was accepted willingly, the spiritual binding became incredibly difficult to break. The victim had essentially given permission for whatever entities were attached to the object to enter their life, and foreign tourists were especially vulnerable because they would typically leave the country before understanding what had happened, making it nearly impossible to seek proper help from qualified Indonesian spiritual practitioners. Tyler felt sick as he read. Everything described in the articles matched his experience perfectly. The elderly woman at the market, her insistence that he accept the pendant, her specific instructions about wearing it and never letting others touch it. Even her timing seemed calculated now. She had approached him after observing him for who knows how long, waiting for the right moment when he was relaxed and open to cultural interaction. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. As Tyler continued researching, he found forum posts and travel blogs from other tourists who had experienced similar encounters in Indonesia. The stories were remarkably consistent. Friendly locals offering free spiritual items, initial feelings of luck and protection, followed by gradual supernatural harassment that escalated until the victims fled the country. Most disturbingly, several accounts mentioned that the supernatural activity didn't stop when they returned home. The cursed objects had created permanent spiritual attachments that followed the victims back to their home countries. Tyler pulled the pendant from beneath his shirt and examined it again under his laptop's screen light. The carved symbols seemed more complex than before, with new details he was certain hadn't been there originally. The wood felt warmer than his body temperature, and when he looked closely, he could swear he saw tiny movements within the grain, like something was shifting beneath the surface. The smell he'd noticed the first night was stronger now, that earthy, organic scent mixed with something that reminded him of incense burned at funeral services. That night, Tyler made a decision that would prove to be a terrible mistake. Instead of seeking help immediately or trying to get rid of the pendant, he decided to test whether his suspicions were correct. He reasoned that if the pendant really was cursed, removing it should provide some relief from the symptoms he'd been experiencing. If nothing changed, then everything was just coincidence and cultural paranoia. Tyler carefully lifted the leather cord over his head and placed the pendant on the nightstand, as far from his bed as the small room allowed. Then he lay down and waited to see what would happen. For about an hour he felt better. The oppressive heaviness that had been building in his chest seemed to lift slightly. The constant feeling of being watched diminished. Tyler began to hope that maybe he had been overthinking everything, that the pendant was just an innocent gift and his imagination had been running wild. But around 2 a.m, Tyler was jolted awake by the sound of scratching coming from somewhere in the room. At first he thought it might be rats in the walls or some other normal explanation, but as he lay still and listened, the scratching became more deliberate, more rhythmic. It sounded like fingernails dragging across wood in a slow, measured pattern. The sound was coming from the direction of the nightstand where he'd placed the pendant. Tyler reached for his phone to use its flashlight, but when the beam illuminated the nightstand, what he saw made his blood run cold. The pendant wasn't where he'd left it. Instead of lying flat on the wooden surface, it was standing upright, balanced impossibly on its edge, slowly rotating in place. As Tyler watched in horror, the rotation stopped, and the pendant tilted toward him like a head turning to look in his direction. The scratching sound intensified, now clearly coming from the pendant itself. Tyler could see tiny grooves appearing in the nightstand's surface around the artifact, as if invisible claws were carving symbols into the wood. The carved designs on the pendant began to glow with a faint, sickly light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Tyler's heartbeat. Then the whispering started, not in Tyler's head this time, but audibly present in the room, coming from the pendant. Multiple voices speaking in what sounded like Javanese, their tone urgent and demanding. Tyler couldn't understand the words, but the emotional content was unmistakable. Anger, hunger, and something that sounded disturbingly like ownership. The voices were discussing him, making plans, arguing about something related to his presence. Tyler wanted to run, to grab his backpack, and flee the guest house immediately, but his body wouldn't respond to his conscious commands. He lay paralyzed in bed, unable to move anything except his eyes, forced to watch as the supernatural activity in his room escalated. The temperature dropped so rapidly that his breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. The smell from the pendant intensified into something nauseating, like rotting flowers mixed with burning hair. Then Tyler saw movement in his peripheral vision. At first, just shadows shifting in the corners of the room, but gradually becoming more distinct. Figures began to materialize in the darkness beyond his phone's light. Not solid exactly, but present enough that Tyler could make out their general shapes. They appeared to be people, or things that had once been people, wearing traditional Indonesian clothing from different historical periods. Some looked ancient, their forms barely coherent wisps of darkness. Others seemed more recent, more solid, more aware of their surroundings. The figures moved slowly around the room, examining Tyler with obvious interest. They seemed to be evaluating him, discussing his suitability for some purpose he couldn't comprehend. Occasionally one would reach toward him with translucent fingers, stopping just short of touching his skin, as if testing the boundaries of what they were allowed to do. Their presence felt hungry, desperate, like they had been waiting for someone like Tyler for a very long time. The whispers from the pendant grew louder and more insistent. Tyler began to understand that the voices were giving instructions to the figures in the room, directing their attention to specific parts of his body: his hands, his eyes, his throat. The entities seemed particularly interested in these areas, moving closer to examine them in detail. Tyler realized with growing horror that they were planning something, preparing for some kind of spiritual possession or attachment that would give them permanent access to his physical form. As Tyler lay paralyzed, watching these spectral figures circle his bed like predators evaluating prey, he began to understand the true magnitude of what he had accepted. This wasn't just some tourist trinket or harmless cultural artifact. The pendant was a spiritual anchor, a carefully crafted conduit designed to bind entities to whoever possessed it. And now, 15 days into what should have been the adventure of a lifetime, Tyler had become the unwilling host to something ancient and hungry. The paralysis lasted until dawn, releasing Tyler just as the first rays of sunlight began filtering through his guest house window. The moment he could move again, he lunged for the pendant, desperate to remove it from his room, from his life, from whatever connection it had created. But when his fingers closed around the carved wood, a shock of pain shot through his entire body, like grabbing a live electrical wire. The pendant had become scorching hot, too hot to touch, yet somehow it didn't burn his skin. Instead, the heat seemed to penetrate directly into his bones, spreading through his nervous system until every nerve ending screamed in agony. Tyler dropped the pendant immediately, but the damage was done. Where his fingers had made contact, angry red marks appeared on the wood surface, as if his touch had somehow marked or claimed the object permanently. The pendant began to emit a low humming sound, barely audible but constant, like the buzzing of insects trapped inside the carved symbols. And Tyler realized with growing horror that he could feel the vibration not just through the air, but resonating inside his own chest, as if something within him was responding to the pendant's call. Tyler spent 3 more days in Indonesia, but they were the longest 72 hours of his life. Sleep became impossible as the pendant's humming grew stronger each night, joined by voices that seemed to emerge from the very walls of whatever accommodation he tried. He switched guest houses twice, hoping distance would break whatever connection had formed, but the supernatural activity followed him everywhere. Other guests began complaining about strange sounds coming from his room. Hotel staff found excuses to avoid cleaning his quarters. Even checking out became awkward as front desk workers stared at him with expressions mixing fear and pity. On his final morning in Yogyakarta, Tyler made one desperate attempt to seek help. A fellow backpacker had mentioned meeting a traditional healer, a dukun, who worked with tourists experiencing spiritual problems. Tyler found the man's small shop tucked behind a batik market, its entrance marked only by hanging amulets and the thick smell of burning incense. The dukun was an elderly Javanese man whose eyes seemed to see far more than they should. The moment Tyler walked through the door, the healer stepped back and began speaking rapidly in Indonesian, gesturing toward Tyler's chest where the pendant hung hidden. The dukun's assistant, a younger woman who spoke English, translated with obvious reluctance. "He says you carry something very old, very angry. He wants to know how long you've had it." When Tyler explained about the encounter at Malioboro Street, the dukun's expression grew grave. More rapid Indonesian followed, punctuated by sharp gestures toward the door. "He says this is not tourist magic. This is binding curse, very powerful. Whoever gave this to you, they know your name, your family, maybe your blood type. This is personal attack, not random gift." The dukun agreed to attempt a cleansing ritual, but his warnings were ominous. "The spirit is attached to you now, not just the object. Removing the pendant will not remove what has already entered your body. We can try to break the binding, but if the attachment is too strong, the backlash could be dangerous." Tyler didn't care about the risks anymore. He just wanted his life back. The ritual began at sunset in a small room behind the shop. The dukun arranged candles in specific patterns around a circle of salt and rice, burning herbs that filled the air with acrid smoke. Tyler sat in the center, the pendant placed on a small wooden table just outside the protective circle. As the chanting began, the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered wildly despite the absence of any wind. The pendant began to vibrate against the table, its humming becoming audible to everyone present. Then the voices started, not whispers this time, but clear, angry speech in what sounded like ancient Javanese. The dukun's chanting became more urgent, his voice straining against whatever forces were responding to his intervention. Tyler felt something moving inside his chest, like insects crawling beneath his skin. The sensation spread to his arms, his throat, his head, as if multiple entities were fighting to maintain their hold on his body. Suddenly, Tyler doubled over and began vomiting black liquid that stank of rotting vegetation and funeral incense. The pendant leaped from the table and began spinning in midair, its carved symbols glowing with that same sickly light Tyler had seen in his guest house. The dukun shouted something in Indonesian, threw a handful of blessed salt toward the spinning object, and the room exploded into chaos. Every candle in the room blew out simultaneously, plunging them into darkness. The sound of breaking glass filled the air, though no windows were present. Tyler felt invisible hands grabbing at him, pulling him in different directions, as if the entities were fighting over possession of his body. Then a scream pierced the darkness, high and keening, definitely female, filled with rage and loss and hunger. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through Tyler's bones. When emergency lighting finally illuminated the room, Tyler was unconscious on the floor, the pendant lying inert beside him. The dukun was pale and shaking, speaking quietly to his assistant. "He says the binding is broken, but something went wrong. Part of the spirit stayed behind, hiding inside you. It will follow you home." Tyler left Indonesia the next day, catching the first available flight to Los Angeles. As his plane lifted off from Soekarno-Hatta International Airport, he felt a mixture of relief and lingering dread. The pendant remained in Indonesia, destroyed by the dukun's ritual, but Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had boarded the plane with him. Back home in suburban California, Tyler tried to return to normal life. He told friends and family that he'd cut his trip short due to food poisoning, unable to explain the truth without sounding insane. But the supernatural activity hadn't ended. His apartment felt wrong, cold spots appearing randomly, shadows moving in his peripheral vision. Electronics malfunctioned around him. His sleep remained broken by dreams of Indonesian temples and chanting voices calling his name. Most disturbing were the photographs. When Tyler finally worked up the courage to review his travel photos, he discovered that the pendant appeared in pictures taken after the cleansing ritual, even though he'd watched it burn. Sometimes it hung around his neck in photos where he remembered not wearing it. Sometimes it appeared in the background of shots taken inside his California apartment, places it had never physically been. The dukun's final warning echoed in Tyler's mind as these incidents continued. Some spirits don't stay behind. They follow their chosen vessel across oceans, through airplane walls, into new countries. Distance means nothing to them. They wait and they watch, and they slowly reclaim what they believe belongs to them. 6 months after returning from Indonesia, Tyler still wakes up some nights to find carved wooden symbols appearing on his bedroom walls, etched into the paint by invisible hands. Still hears whispered Javanese prayers at 3 a.m. Still catches glimpses of traditional Indonesian clothing in his peripheral vision when he's alone. So remember Tyler's story the next time you travel to Southeast Asia. When kind strangers offer spiritual gifts, when elderly women insist you need protection, when something seems too generous to refuse. Not all hospitality comes from pure intentions. Not all gifts are meant to be taken, and some attachments, once formed, last far longer than any vacation. Never accept spiritual items from strangers in Indonesia. Not all gifts are meant to be taken.